Jesus finds himself on the defense in today's gospel reading. Last week we heard the Pharisees in their attempt to trap Jesus by asking him an impossible question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to a pagan regime, opposing the people that God has claimed for his own? Later that same day, the Sadducees ask him another seemingly impossible question. Suppose a woman has been widowed 7 times. The resurrection from the dead on the last day, whose wife will she be? In both instances, Jesus leaves his antagonizers speechless and the crowd in awe of his teaching. The Pharisees then get together one more time to try and stump Jesus, right? You can imagine the scene like a sort of bad YouTube video attempting to go viral, Jewish rabbi exposed, right? And they say, we're going to do this. We're going to get our best scribe, our best teacher of the law to pose a question to him. So this scribe, this expert in the law, goes to Jesus and says, "Teacher, simple question for you. Which of the 613 commandments in the law would you say is the most important?" And Jesus responds by turning to a verse that was at the core of the Jewish tradition. It was a prayer that devout Jews would recite every morning, every evening. It would have been one that everyone there was acquainted with. It was known as the Shema because in Hebrew it begins, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And Jesus takes it a step further by adding, and the second is just like the first. You need to love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang not just all the law, not just all the 613 commandments that Moses gave, but the prophets as well. You can sum up all of their teaching in this dual command to love God and love neighbor. If all you do is talk about your personal relationship with God, Jesus doesn't seem to have time for that. Loving God is not enough, he says. The commentators agree that by saying the second is like unto it, or the second is just like it, Jesus is equating love of God with love of neighbor. The commands are of equal importance, of equal weight to Jesus. There can be no love of God without love of one's neighbor as well. So, it all comes down to our ability to love, which sounds like a very sentimental prospect, especially given the fact that Jesus said that you need to do this with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, because we read all those things in very sort of sentimental, emotional ways, quite differently than Jesus' original hearers would have necessarily heard it. But if you've ever encountered someone that you find who's difficult to love, you'll acknowledge that no amount of thinking about it can get you there. I know it's irrational, she said, but there's just something about him that I can't stand. Surprisingly enough, we don't become loving by trying to love someone else. If we take the command to love in the abstract, we'll find that it is an entirely impossible thing to do. That's because love is not an abstraction. It's not an emotion or a feeling. It's not something that can be conjured up on demand. Love is a concrete action. Virtues like faith, hope, and love talked about in our collect for the day, they ride on the back of everyday habits and practices, which is to say that we don't learn to love someone by trying to love them. as counterintuitive as that may sound. If you want an increase of your faith in your life, you don't just sit and go, all right, I need to have more faith. I'm gonna conjure up more faith. No, you begin to practice the habits that make you a more faithful human being. And in particular, as Christians, it means attending to your prayer life. It means reading the scriptures. It means making confession on a regular basis. The Christian tradition tells us how to increase our faith. And we don't do it by sitting alone and thinking, all right, if I just think about it hard enough, if I just meditate on these doctrines, I will be more faithful. No. The same is true with love. We become loving people by practicing the sort of habits that produce love in us. So when St. Paul commands the Romans to genuinely love their neighbors, genuinely love even their enemies, he shows them what that looks like. He says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For Aquinas, love is not only to will the good of the other, but also to choose it too. St. James gives the example of someone who looks at an ill-clad, malnourished neighbor and says, go in peace, be warm, be filled, but who provides nothing for their needs. That person might will the good of the other, James says, but without choosing the good of the other, without making the effort to meet their needs as well, James says, well, for Christians, thoughts and prayers don't mean a lot. You need to put some action behind it too. We become loving people by practicing certain concrete actions. No amount of reason, no amount of willpower can get us there. Often, reason and willpower might serve to excuse us from doing those things that lead to loving our neighbor. Well, if you haven't picked up on it yet, St. Paul and St. James and the New Testament tradition say that love is evidenced through a very specific action, which we see displayed both in the Incarnation and in the Atonement. God so loved the world that he gave. According to St. Paul, then as well, we become loving by imitating the example we see in Jesus. Walk in love, he says, as Christ loved us and gave himself. Love and gave, it is the way that he combines those words and that phrase there, that and is a sort of conjunction that makes the two equivalent. To love is to give. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, an offering and sacrifice to God. Love gives. We learn to love by learning to give of ourselves and what belongs to us, both to God and to those we encounter. For all we encounter are our neighbor. Which is to say that our ability to give deeply and generously of ourselves and our possessions is a matter of discipleship. It's why Jesus makes such a big deal about money and possessions in the Gospels. Because our gifts become acts of love that unite us to the one who is God's gift to us. In other words, our ability to give deeply and generously of ourselves and of what belongs to us is a matter of discipleship. It's a matter of spiritual growth. It's a matter of our faith. Our generosity is evidence of our ability to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves, because love gives. My daughter looked at my finances recently and came to the conclusion that I can't afford to maintain my current lifestyle if I keep giving what I give to the church, a parishioner once said to me. Well, you know, we understand a lot of people live on a fixed income, I said. We know that sometimes people have to scale back their pledge. Yeah, I think that's what my daughter was suggesting too, she said. But I just told her that the problem might not actually be with my lifestyle, or I told her the problem must be with my lifestyle, and that if there is no room in my budget to keep giving 10% back to God, then I have no business doing half of the things I'm currently doing with my money. Love gives. And because it gives, it comes as a sacrifice to us. A sacrifice that might even be felt as a sort of death to the things we could use those resources for. But as followers of the one who gave himself without reserve for us and for the whole world, our neighbors, what other choice do we have?